wind was already screaming through the Gallatin Valley in late October, carrying the kind of dry, biting ice crystals that promised a killing winter. In 1886, most homesteaders in the Montana Territory were doing the only sensible thing a man could do when the mercury dropped. They were frantically felling lodgepole pines, bucking them into rounds, and splitting them into cords of firewood. The equation for survival was simple. You cut wood until your hands bled, and then you cut more. Because when the temperature hit 40 below, a cast iron stove would eat a tree a week. But Jacob Reinhardt was not cutting wood. He was hauling stone. For 3 weeks, while his neighbors rushed to secure their fuel supplies, Reinhardt had been dragging a sledge loaded with granite river rock from the creek bed up to his ridgeline cabin. He wasn't building a wall. He wasn't building a root cellar. He was hauling tons of cold, gray stone through the front door of his 16 by 20 cabin and stacking it in the center of the room. He mixed mortar with freezing hands, painstakingly laying course after course of heavy rock until the structure dominated the small living space. It was 5 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and rose all the way to the ridgepole. The neighbors stopped by to watch the spectacle. They called it Reinhardt's Tomb. They called it the Indoor Mountain. One man, a seasoned trapper who had survived 20 winters in the high country, told Reinhardt he was building a monument to stupidity. Why, he asked, would you fill your limited living space with a rock pile that did nothing but radiate cold? Why would you waste precious daylight mixing lime and sand when you should be swinging an axe? They laughed when he told them his plan. They laughed because they understood the brutal reality of a Montana winter, and they knew that a fire needed to roar to keep death at bay. Reinhardt didn't argue. He just kept stacking stone. While his neighbors prepared to wake up every 2 hours to feed their iron stoves, risking frostbite and sleep deprivation, he was building a machine that would allow him to light one fire, just one, and let it die out an hour later, yet keep his cabin at a steady shirt-sleeve 70 degrees for 3 full days. He was building a lost branch of thermal engineering that solves the single biggest problem facing the modern off-gridder: energy independence. You don't need a forest of firewood to survive the winter. You need to understand the physics of the mountain. To understand why Reinhardt's pile of rocks was a stroke of genius, you have to understand the engineering failure he was rejecting. The standard heating technology of the late 19th century, and tragically, of many cabins today, was the cast iron box stove. In the 1880s, this was considered the height of modernity. It was portable, it was relatively cheap, and when you stuffed it full of dry pine and opened the damper, it could raise the temperature of a frozen room by 50 degrees in 20 minutes. But that speed came at a terrible price. The physics of a metal stove are defined by high thermal conductivity and low thermal mass. Iron is an excellent conductor. It grabs the energy from the burning wood and immediately transfers it to the air in the room. This sounds efficient, but it creates a violent, unsustainable energy curve. The moment the fire is roaring, the stove is radiating intense, scorching heat. The metal surfaces can reach 600 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the air around the stove into a desiccated, superheated blast zone. However, metal has almost zero capacity to store energy. It is a conduit, not a battery. The moment the flames die down, the iron goes cold. This creates the temperature roller coaster. At 8:30 p.m., the cabin is 90 degrees, forcing you to open a window. By 2 a.m., it is 40 degrees, forcing you to wake up shivering to restart the cycle. You are running a thermal treadmill, burning 4 times the wood necessary because you are trying to heat the air over and over again, rather than maintaining a thermal baseline. The neighbors on the ridge accepted this misery as the price of survival. They believed that heat only existed where there was fire. If the fire went out, the cold came in. That was the rule. But Reinhardt looked at the cast iron box and saw it for what it was: a sieve. It didn't capture heat, it hemorrhaged it. He realized that the problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the material inside. He didn't need a hotter fire. He needed a material that could eat fire and slowly, patiently bleed it back out. He needed the one thing a metal stove could never provide: thermal mass. Reinhardt's indoor mountain worked because he understood specific heat capacity. Air and iron have low capacity. They transfer energy rapidly, acting more like a wire than a battery. Stone is stubborn. It demands a massive amount of energy to warm up, but once it accepts that energy, it refuses to let it go. In modern electrical terms, he wasn't building a conductor. He was building a capacitor designed to absorb a massive surge of energy, the violence of a fire, and store it within the molecular structure of the material itself. The math behind his madness was undeniable. A standard cast iron stove of that era might weigh 300 or 400 pounds. That is the limit of its thermal mass. Once those 400 pounds are saturated with heat, any excess energy is simply dumped into the room or lost up the chimney. Reinhardt's structure, built from dense granite river rock and mortar, weighed approximately 6,000 pounds. That is 15 times the thermal mass of the iron stove. It was a thermal battery of immense capacity, capable of swallowing the energy of a raging fire without overwhelming the room. Where the metal stove is a sprint, the stone mass is a marathon. This immense mass creates a phenomenon known as clipping the peak. When you light a fire in a metal stove, the room temperature spikes dangerously high, often making the cabin uncomfortably hot while the fire is burning. The energy release is immediate and uncontrolled. But in Reinhardt's masonry heater, the stone acts as a thermal sponge. As the fire burns at maximum intensity, the stone absorbs the heat almost as fast as the fire produces it. The room doesn't overheat because the energy isn't going into the air, it's going into the rock. The stone effectively shaves off the dangerous peak of the fire's output and banks it for later. Once charged, the physics of the release change. A metal stove heats through convection, warming air that rises to the ceiling and leaks away. Reinhardt's stone mountain heats through radiation. It emits energy in the infrared spectrum, like the sun. This energy travels through the air until it hits a solid object, a wall, a chair, or a human body, and warms it directly. It is a silent, draft-free warmth. This radiant release is slow and steady. Because the stone has such high density, it releases its stored energy over a period of 24 to 72 hours. This is the release rate. While the iron stove goes cold in 2 hours, the masonry mass is just getting started. But a battery this size has a catch. You cannot charge 6,000 pounds of granite with a flickering candle. To drive the heat deep into the mass, you have to abandon everything you know about conserving wood. Reinhardt's neighbors believed that to conserve their woodpile, they had to make every log last as long as possible. They would load their cast iron stoves with large round logs and damp down the air intake, choking the oxygen supply until the fire was a smoldering glow. They called this banking the fire. In reality, it was waste on a massive scale. The chemistry of combustion is not intuitive. When you throw a log on a fire, you are not burning wood, you are burning gas. As the wood heats up, it undergoes pyrolysis, breaking down into volatile gases, hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and methane. These gases contain nearly 60% of the potential heat energy in that log. But here is the catch. Those gases will not ignite unless the temperature in the firebox exceeds 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, and they require a massive surplus of oxygen to burn completely. When the neighbors choked their stoves, the temperature dropped below the ignition point of the gases, 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. The wood didn't burn, it distilled. Valuable fuel floated up the chimney as smoke and condensed into dangerous creosote. They were coating their exhaust systems with the very energy they were trying to save. Reinhardt did the exact opposite. He split his wood small to maximize surface area and opened the air intake wide. He didn't choke the fire, he force-fed it oxygen. The result was a roar. The temperature in the core rocketed past 1800 degrees. At that temperature, the volatile gases ignite instantly. The smoke itself burns. This violence was the secret to his efficiency. Because the combustion was complete, there was no smoke and no creosote. While his neighbors' chimneys belched thick gray plumes, Reinhardt's chimney showed nothing but a faint heat shimmer. He was extracting 90% of the wood's energy in a 90-minute burn cycle. But generating 1800 degrees of heat is the easy part. The hard part is catching it before it escapes. If you attach a standard chimney to an 1800-degree fire, you have essentially created a jet engine that vents into space. A straight vertical flue creates a powerful draft, a vacuum that pulls air through the stove and shoots it out the roof. In a standard cabin, this draft is so strong it doesn't just pull smoke, it pulls the heat right out of the metal box before it can radiate into the room. It sucks the warm air you've already heated right out of the cracks in your walls. You are effectively heating the clouds while your feet freeze. Reinhardt understood that to capture that violence, he had to break the rules of airflow. He had to make the smoke do something it hates to do. He had to make it go down. Inside that massive pile of granite, hidden behind the mortar and the rough-hewn face, was a complex network of channels. This is the labyrinth, or in engineering terms, the contraflow flue system. Reinhardt didn't build a solid block. He built a hollow, twisting circulatory system of firebrick. When the superheated gas rises from the firebox, it doesn't go up the chimney. It hits a diversion plate, a heavy slab of refractory stone that forces the exhaust sideways and then plunges it downward. This is the genius of the design. Heat naturally wants to rise. By forcing the exhaust gases to travel downward through channels carved into the outer shell of the masonry, Reinhardt forced the gas to fight against its own buoyancy. This struggle creates turbulence. It forces the gas to scrub against the rough inner walls of the stone channels. Every inch of that journey is a transfer of energy. The gas is desperate to give up its heat, and the stone is hungry to take it. The exhaust travels down the left side, across the bottom, and up the right side, winding through a serpentine path that maximizes the surface area of the contact. The result is a massive thermal exchange. In the firebox, the gas is 1800 degrees. As it crests the top of the burn chamber and begins its descent, it is still white hot. But as it travels down the first channel, dumping energy into the granite skin, it drops to 1200 degrees. As it turns the corner at the base of the heater, it falls to 800. By the time it finally reaches the exit flue near the floor and begins its ascent up the actual chimney stack, that gas has been stripped of its power. It exits the house at a manageable 300 degrees. Reinhardt had successfully stolen 1500 degrees of heat from the smoke and locked it inside the stone battery standing in his living room. But this labyrinth creates a physics problem of its own: friction. Forcing air to travel through 20 feet of twisting, turning stone passages creates immense resistance. A standard stove relies on the natural buoyancy of hot smoke to create a draft. If you try to push smoke down a cold stone channel, it will stall. It will back up. It will fill the room with carbon monoxide. To make the labyrinth work, the system needs a prime. This is why Reinhardt built his chimney stack nearly 4 feet higher than the roofline, taller than any neighbor's. He needed to create a massive pressure differential, a vacuum pump powerful enough to drag that heavy, cooling gas through the maze. He also installed a bypass damper, a secret door in the stonework. When starting the fire, he would open this bypass, allowing the smoke to shoot straight up, heating the chimney and establishing the draft. Once the roar was established, once the vacuum was pulling hard, he would slam the bypass shut, forcing the fire into the labyrinth. It was a manual transmission for a thermal engine. He was driving the heat, not just watching it burn. And once that engine was running, once the stone began to saturate with the energy stripped from the smoke, the weather outside ceased to matter. The engineering theory was sound, but in the Montana Territory, theory dies at 20 below zero. The true test came on January 12th. The barometric pressure dropped, the wind shifted aggressively to the north, and the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. It was the kind of deep, resonant cold that snaps tree limbs like dry pasta and turns breath into instant ice fog. In the cabin surrounding Reinhardt's ridge, the battle for survival began immediately. By midnight, the cast-iron stoves were losing the war. The neighbors were trapped in a brutal cycle of exhaustion. Every 90 minutes, the creeping cold would penetrate their bedding, waking them with a shivering start. They would stumble blindly to the woodpile, shove in more frozen logs, and wait for the metal to roar back to life. For 20 minutes, they would sweat next to the stove while their backs remained freezing, victims of the convective draft. Then the fire would die, the iron would cool, and the cold would return. It was a violent oscillation between sweltering and freezing. The drafts howled through the chinking. The wood piles dwindled at a terrifying rate. By the second day, faces were gaunt, tempers were short, and the genuine fear of running out of fuel began to set in. Inside Reinhardt's cabin, the rhythm was entirely different. At sunset, he loaded the firebox with 40 pounds of split pine. He opened the air intake wide and let the fire rage for exactly 2 hours. The roar was deafening, a contained jet engine of heat charging the battery. The stone surface temperature climbed steadily, 90 degrees, 100, topping out at a comfortable 150 degrees. Then, the fire died. The coals turned to white ash. Reinhardt closed the damper, sealing the chimney tight. The fire was gone, but the heat remained. For the rest of the night, there was no sound, no crackling wood, no roaring draft, just a profound, silent warmth radiating from the center of the room. The stone mass acted like a miniature sun. It didn't heat the air, it heated the objects. The walls were warm, the floor was warm, the bed was warm. While his neighbors shivered in the convective drafts of their cooling stoves, Reinhardt slept in a radiant bubble. The temperature in the cabin held steady at 68 degrees, while the blizzard outside screamed at the walls. He didn't wake up to stoke the fire. He didn't wake up at all. 3 days later, when the wind finally broke, 2 neighbors trudged through the drifts to Reinhardt's door. They expected the worst. They expected to find a frozen corpse or a man driven mad by the cold huddled over a dead stove. Instead, Reinhardt opened the door in his shirt sleeves. A wave of gentle warmth rolled out into the snow. The neighbors looked past him at the massive stone pile. There was no fire in the grate. There hadn't been one for 12 hours. Yet the rock was still warm to the touch, radiating the stored energy of a fire that had long since burned out. They weren't looking at a tomb anymore. They were looking at the future of survival. You do not need a time machine to verify Reinhardt's results. You do not need to endure a Montana blizzard or haul 3 tons of granite from a riverbed. You can prove the physics of the masonry heater in your own garage this weekend with a mini masonry core experiment. This is the litmus test that separates folklore from engineering. If you are skeptical, and you should be, this is how you see the numbers with your own eyes. To build this proof of concept, you need specific materials. You cannot use standard red clay bricks or concrete pavers found at a garden center. They will crack and spall under the thermal shock we are about to induce. You need refractory fire brick, the dense, heavy yellow bricks used to line kilns and industrial furnaces. These bricks are engineered to handle temperatures in excess of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit without flinching. You also need a specific mortar. Do not use Portland cement. Cement is too rigid. It cannot expand and contract with the heat cycle. You need a mix of fire clay and sand, a soft mortar that breathes with the fire. Construct a simple test stack. Build a small firebox, perhaps 8 inches wide and 12 inches deep, and create a short riser or chimney stack about 2 feet high. Cap this structure with a heavy mass of solid brick, maybe 20 or 30 bricks stacked tightly on top of the firebox ceiling. This is your thermal battery. Drill a small hole into the center of that mass and insert a K-type thermocouple probe connected to a digital data logger. This probe is your window into the thermal wave. Now, conduct the burn. Remember the rule: violence, not duration. Load the small firebox with dry split lumber. Light it and give it maximum air. You want the fire to rage. You want to hear the rocket sound, the low-frequency rumble of air being sucked into the combustion chamber. Run this fire hard for exactly 45 minutes. Then stop. Let the fire go out. Close the air intake. Here is where the data defies intuition. If you were monitoring a cast iron stove, your temperature graph would look like a cliff. The moment the fire died, the temperature would plummet. But look at the data logger on your masonry stack. When the fire goes out at the 45-minute mark, the temperature in the center of the brick mass is actually quite low. The outside of the stack might still feel cool to the touch. You might think the experiment failed, but wait. 1 hour after the fire is dead, the temperature on the graph starts to climb. 2 hours after the fire is dead, the temperature is still rising. The bricks are now hot to the touch. This is the thermal lag. The heat generated during that violent 45-minute burn did not disappear. It was absorbed into the inner face of the fire brick and has been slowly traveling, molecule by molecule, through the dense material. 4 hours after the fire is out, the surface temperature of your mini core peaks. It is radiating a steady, powerful heat that you can feel from 3 feet away. The fire is a distant memory, nothing but cold ash in the bottom of the box. Yet the structure is pumping out energy. This is the flywheel effect. You have successfully decoupled the time of the burn from the time of the heating. You have proven that a short, high-intensity input can yield a long-duration, low-intensity output. The graph doesn't lie. The brick captured the violence of the flame and translated it into the stability of the stone. If 30 bricks can hold heat for 4 hours, imagine what 6,000 pounds of granite can do. The mini-core experiment proves the physics, but a pile of 30 bricks will not keep you alive when the grid goes down in January. To replicate Reinhardt's success, you must scale this technology up to a functional, habitable size. This is not a weekend carpentry project. You are not building a cabinet. You are building a piece of civil engineering inside your home. And like any engineering project, if you ignore the load calculations or the thermal dynamics, the failure will be catastrophic. The transition from a test model to a life-sustaining machine requires a blueprint that respects 3 non-negotiable realities: gravity, expansion, and capacity. The first reality is gravity. A functional masonry heater capable of heating a 1,000 square foot cabin will require between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds of stone and brick. You are essentially parking a full-sized pickup truck in the center of your living room. If you attempt to build this on a standard wood-framed floor, you will crush the joists and send the entire structure crashing into the basement. Reinhardt understood this. He didn't build on the floor, he built through the floor. A masonry heater requires a dedicated concrete footing, reinforced with rebar, poured directly onto undisturbed soil or bedrock, completely independent of the house's foundation. The heater does not rest on the house. The house effectively floats around the heater. Once the foundation is secure, you must address the second reality: thermal expansion. You are building a machine that will have an internal temperature of 1,800 degrees and an external temperature of 150 degrees. The laws of physics dictate that the inner core will expand significantly more than the outer shell. If you bond the fire brick core directly to the stone facing with mortar, the inner core will grow, push outwards, and crack the beautiful stone exterior like an eggshell within the first week of operation. To prevent this, you must build 2 separate structures that never touch. The inner core, the firebox and the labyrinth channels, is built from high-duty fire brick and refractory mortar. This is the engine. The outer shell, the granite, soapstone, or brick facing, is the chassis. Between these 2 layers, you must install an expansion joint. Modern builders use ceramic wool blankets or even simple corrugated cardboard that burns away, leaving a precise air gap. This gap allows the engine to swell and breathe with the violence of the fire without transferring that mechanical stress to the chassis. The heat jumps the gap via radiation, but the physical movement remains isolated. The third reality is capacity, or sizing. You cannot simply guess how big to make the heater. If you build it too small, the mass will saturate too quickly, and you won't get the carryover heat to last through the night. Build it too large, and you will never get the mass up to temperature, leaving you with a giant, lukewarm monolith. The math is derived from your climate's demand. You must calculate the heat loss of your cabin in British thermal units per hour. For a standard, moderately insulated cabin in a northern climate, you might need 30,000 BTUs per hour to maintain comfort. A masonry heater delivers this differently. Since you are firing it only once or twice a day, the mass must store 24 hours worth of heat in a single 2-hour charge. If your daily demand is roughly 700,000 BTUs and masonry stores about 30 BTUs per pound at a useful temperature range, you can work backward to find the weight. You aren't designing for aesthetics, you are designing for mass. This is why the Finnish contraflow and the Russian bell designs are the gold standards. The Finnish style uses long vertical channels to force gas down against buoyancy, maximizing the scrub. The Russian style uses a series of stacked chambers, or bells, where hot gas pools at the top and cools before sinking, a design that is incredibly efficient at harvesting heat even with lower draft. Finally, you must respect the danger. A masonry heater is the safest form of heating ever devised, but only if operated correctly. Because the system relies on a shutoff damper to trap the heat once the fire is out, the risk of carbon monoxide is real. If you close that damper while there are still blue flames or unburned coals, you are sealing a poison gas generator inside your home. The rule is absolute. The damper stays open until the fire is dead and the coals are black. There is no cheating the chemistry. You are harnessing a reaction that wants to consume oxygen and produce poison. Your job is to ensure it finishes its meal before you lock the door. Reinhardt survived because he respected the stone, but he thrived because he respected the fire. The true miracle of the indoor mountain wasn't just that it kept Jacob Reinhardt warm while the valley froze. It was that it kept him free. While his neighbors spent their winter days chained to the axe and the saw, enslaved by the insatiable appetite of their iron stoves, Reinhardt was free to repair gear, hunt, or simply rest. He burned 1/3 of the fuel his neighbors consumed, yet he lived in a home that felt like summer in the middle of January. He had traded the frantic, endless labor of continuous fuel input for the patient, heavy engineering of thermal storage. The neighbors called him a fool for hauling stone, but the real foolishness was believing a thin iron box could conquer a Montana winter. Somewhere along the timeline of the 20th century, we collectively forgot this trade. We fell into the convenience trap. We swapped the thermal stability of stone for the instant gratification of the forced air furnace and the thermostat. We decided that it was easier to burn cheap, abundant fossil fuels in thin metal boxes than to invest in the heavy, permanent infrastructure of masonry. We chose speed over resilience, and we chose lightweight cheapness over heavy efficiency. But today, as energy prices climb and grid reliability falters, the laughter on the ridge has stopped. The physics of the past are becoming the solutions of the future. The lesson here isn't that you must live in a log cabin or quarry your own granite from a frozen riverbed. The lesson is that you need to stop looking at heating as a consumption problem and start looking at it as a storage problem. Fire is fleeting. Heat shouldn't be. Whether you are retrofitting a suburban home or designing an off-grid sanctuary, the principle remains absolute. You can fight the cold with constant effort, or you can outlast it with mass. Jacob Reinhardt wasn't a wizard, and he wasn't a prophet. He was just a pragmatist who looked at a pile of cold rocks and saw a battery waiting to be charged. He understood that in the brutal mathematics of survival, the heaviest weapon usually wins. The stone is patient. If you treat it right, it will carry you through the night when the fire is long dead. So before you buy another cord of wood or crank up the thermostat, ask yourself if you are heating your home or just heating the air. Build heavy, burn hot, and stay warm.